The most successful propaganda and manipulation campaigns have what they often call kernels of truth inside of them. And any sort of misleading information, if to be effective, usually has to have some kernels of truth in it. So it may be true that that drug could have been helpful for some people, but is that going to be a cure-all for everyone? That's sort of an element of persuasion that's happening there, right? And so, I mean, advertising is a persuasion as a form of, well, some might say corporate propaganda or propaganda for a particular entity, even if we often use propaganda to talk about political campaigns, and we talk about advertising to refer to commercial campaigns.
Right.
But those sorts of processes and types of communication date back many centuries. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephen Barnard. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Butler University, and you're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content. In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, a dangerous idea began spreading faster than the virus itself. Bleach could cure the disease. Vaccines were more dangerous than the illness. Simple remedies were being suppressed by a vast conspiracy. These weren't just fringe ideas confined to the dark corners of the internet. They were amplified by influential figures, shared millions of times, and ultimately contributed to preventable deaths. What started as digital misinformation was killing people in the real world too. But here's the unsettling truth. While some misinformation spreads accidentally, there's often a deliberate system underneath, designed to profit from this confusion, to gain power through chaos, and to turn our own psychology against us. How do we tell the difference between an honest mistake and a deliberate lie? Why are some of us more vulnerable to manipulation than others? And when misinformation goes viral, who actually benefits? From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and joining me for a conversation is someone whose latest book, Hacking Hybrid Media, exposes the mechanisms behind our information crisis, who has spent over a decade studying how problematic information flows through our digital world, and whose research reveals the life and death stakes of the misinformation epidemic. Dr. Stephen Barnard. As we take a bit of a deeper dive into misinformation and then health misinformation specifically, I thought a good place to start would be, do you recall the first instance where what was the first piece of health misinformation you've ever seen? And then you knew at the time that it was misinformation.
Oh, well, I'll go with this one. So I can remember, one of the classes I taught when I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Missouri, I was partly in the Peace Studies program there, which I had taught for previously, and I was partly at the journalism school, and I was teaching a class for a few hundred students, and it was kind of like intro to journalism for non-majors, and we were doing media literacy type of work. I was trying to sort of expose students to good and bad information. This is kind of the early ideas of what later becomes quote unquote fake news. And so I was looking for some examples to kind of conduct an exercise in this large lecture class. And so I was digging through all of these videos and some of them are related to health communication. And I found one of those later. At the time, the technical term for this is called a video news release, which is basically a paid for news segment that is scripted by whoever created and funded it. In this case, this was some sort of pharmaceutical company, I believe. And putting that next to an actual piece of real news that was so terrible that it was almost unbelievable. And so I showed these to my students and asked them to discern, which was the true information and which was the, kind of piece of fake news. And I don't want to say that it was misinformation per se. This gets into the nuances of what we mean by misinformation. But it was, as I recall, it was a pharmaceutical company trying to sell their latest product by basically, paying people to wear white coats and to sort of show the administering of this drug, and then to sort of provide a script for newscasters to read that on air as if it was breaking news or something, when really it was just a PR segment sent to them. So again, another way in which sort of investigative journalism may be harder to come by. It's much cheaper just to read a script that somebody sends you than to send a reporter out there to dig up the news. And that, I can remember in that exercise, the room was split 50-50. Half of the students thought that segment was real, and half of them thought it was fake of some sort. And when I told them that it wasn't original journalism, that it was just a kind of PR advertisement that was masked as news.
What Dr. Barnard discovered in the classroom wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a preview of our current crisis. Video news releases, or VNRs, represents $1 billion industry where companies create fake news segments that local TV stations broadcast as real journalism. When half the students couldn't tell the difference between news and advertising, it foreshadowed how millions would later struggle to identify misinformation on social media.
And I remember at that point when I was looking for that one, I found a dozen other ones just like it. And so that was disturbing for me to see just how much kind of spin is put on health communications thanks to profit orientation, which isn't the same thing as misinformation per se. But if someone's trying to sell you something, they're not necessarily trying to give you the best information. They're trying to give you whatever information will convince you to talk to your doctor about a prescription or to do something else, which in the US at least is very, very common.
I want to dig into that a little bit deeper because there's that undertone of manipulation or persuasion, negative persuasion, whatever we decide to call it. And that there's a couple terms that I'm aware of that exists out there. You mentioned misinformation. It seems like disinformation is another term. You introduced fake news. How do we draw the lines between those concepts? How are they different and how are they similar?
Yes. The classic distinction oftentimes, I think, in popular discourse and certainly in some of the research communities is between misinformation and disinformation. And the sort of key distinction between them is to say misinformation is like an accidental sharing of false information. And so when someone is misinformed, they're often unaware that they have been misled in some way or another. Oftentimes misinformation has kind of a short duration. So it's not a sustained campaign of accidentally passing on false information because most communicators are trying, I think, to get the facts right. And so misinformation is accidental.
So that would be like, Stephen, I heard it was 100 degrees outside today. Is that kind of, and I maybe heard that wrongly from someone and I didn't have bad intent to tell you that information, but it just factually wrong.
That's right.
Is that an example? Okay.
That's right. And those sorts of conversational, interactional types of instances go back centuries and centuries, right? This is a very classic phenomenon in the world, certainly. And so, misinformation is a very mundane thing. It happens all the time. People can misspeak. And the sort of traditional, since I can remember as a child playing the telephone game in school.
Right.
And that is an instance of misinformation, usually.
Right.
Now, sometimes there's someone in those telephone games who intentionally says the wrong thing to their neighbor to try and change the message for some reason. And then you start to get into something more, what looks more like disinformation, which is the result of a deliberate and often, in some cases, a sustained effort to sort of sway or sow confusion among the public by like mixing facts with falsehoods and kind of sometimes they manipulate the context in order to kind of support a preferred conclusion that they're trying to reach. And so they might muddy the waters. A kind of a classic idea of this that has been talked about from the former editor of Breitbart, a former Trump administration official, and now a kind of a political commentator in his own right, Steve Bannon. He basically talked about how one strategy is to just flood the zone. If you can't win the argument, you can just flood it with bad information, confusing information, and that then destabilizes and creates a less clear playing field upon which people can sort facts out.
Bannon's strategy to flood the zone with overwhelming information has become the playbook for modern disinformation campaigns. Researchers call this truth decay, the blurring of lines between opinion and fact, between reliable and unreliable sources. The goal isn't to convince you of a particular lie, but to make you doubt everything. When people can't distinguish truth from falsehood, democracy itself becomes vulnerable.
Disinformation is a classic piece of that. But as you mentioned, fake news, which is just kind of false narratives that are masked to look as news, and sometimes that's satirical. We can think of a lot of television shows that kind of use that satire as a frame. I mean, the Daily Show and the Colbert Report sometimes as old school examples of that. There are many, many examples of fake news in a more satirical sense, but it as you and many listeners probably know, it took its own flair in the mid 2010s in particular when news websites and since then, unfortunately, and news websites are kind of being created falsely to reflect information that is fabricated by individuals or increasingly by AI or something to spread things that are not necessarily true but that look like a traditional news segment. But yeah, these things get so muddy. I often just kind of use the term problematic information as a kind of blanket term to describe kind of false or misleading information.
So if the examples we just talked about and are more digital era examples, and you mentioned how misinformation kind of persisted over a long period of time. Is that also the same of disinformation and fake news as well before sort of the digital age? Like what did that look like?
Yeah, there's a long history of propaganda, obviously, and persuasion, and the attempts for people to create a message that sort of includes certain bits of information, some of which are probably true. The most successful propaganda and manipulation campaigns have what they often call kernels of truth inside of them.
Those kernels of truth Dr. Barnard mentions are crucial to understanding why misinformation works. The tobacco industry pioneered this approach in the 1950s, deliberately undermining scientific evidence about smoking's health risks by mixing small truths with larger lies. This same tobacco industry playbook has been adopted by other industries, including fossil fuel companies, often using the same PR firms and researchers. The internet didn't invent this playbook. It just made it infinitely more powerful.
And any sort of misleading information, if to be effective, usually has to have some kernels of truth in it. So it may be true that that drug could have been helpful for some people, but is that going to be a cure-all for everyone? That's sort of an element of persuasion that's happening there, right? And so, I mean, advertising is a persuasion as a form of, well, some might say corporate propaganda or propaganda for a particular entity, even if we often use propaganda to talk about political campaigns, and we talk about advertising to refer to commercial campaigns.
Right.
But those sorts of processes and types of communication date back many centuries, right? We can certainly think about the earlier forms of those things, whether that's through leaflets or newsletters and more stagnant or even oral forms of communication. But yeah, they become more sophisticated and I would say harder to identify and combat. Ironically, in this information age that we live in, where we have more information than ever before, but the tools to decipher and discern what are the most well-informed and valuable of those are harder to come by and yet more important than ever.
So why do they work? What is it about how we're wired as human beings that makes these disinformation campaigns or fake news campaigns effective at driving? So you mentioned that there's sort of agenda driven to shift you towards drawing a certain conclusion or taking a certain action. Why are they so particularly effective? What is it about how we as humans are wired? Why this can move us in that way?
I mean, there are certain types of people who are more susceptible to this than others. I mean, obviously, people who are existing more or less in what sometimes is referred to as an echo chamber are much more likely, I think, to fall victim to certain types of bad information, in part because they are often not diversifying their information diet in a sufficient enough way. In the US, for example, there's a lot of research that shows that conservative leaning people are much more likely to rely on certain types of sources that often kind of affirm their worldview rather than those that kind of challenge their beliefs. People who are more liberal or moderate, at least in the US, tend to have a more diverse media diet. Doesn't mean that everyone is like this. So they're going to go find sources in other places. So the more diverse your diet is, the more you're likely to confront other bits of information that may complicate or challenge some of those perspectives. So people who have a very strong, if their identity is really driven by political ideology, they're much more likely to be susceptible to this. It matters more that they believe what their people believe than it does to believe what is true. And so people who might be more committed to certain political identities can sometimes be more susceptible. And I would say in general, people who are kind of prone to conspiratorial thinking are probably more likely to fall victim to manipulative forms of media. In part, that's maybe just because it kind of fits in. I knew that was the case. I knew that those people were out to get us, but if they lack literacy skills of various sorts. But I think in general, people sometimes can be convinced by, especially in an era where trust in institutions is as low as it is, and this is especially true in the United States. It is, I think, true in a lot of other countries, but maybe not to as great of extent as the US, where here the population has very low trust in, generally speaking, across the board in many institutions, whether it's science and health and government and media.
The trust crisis that Dr. Barnard describes is measurable and alarming. According to a recent Gallup poll, American adults' trust in mass media has hit a record low of just 31%. This erosion didn't happen overnight. It's a result of decades of deliberate attack on expertise, amplified by social media algorithms that reward outrage over accuracy.
And so in an environment like that, where you already have a lot of distrust, then some other kind of answers to those questions that seem to fill in the gaps, maybe they play a little bit more effectively on those hearts and minds than they would by others who tend to have a trust in more mainstream institutions.
I was thinking about an analogy before we started recording, and I came up with this thing where it almost feels like science is in the courtroom, science is on trial, is the defendant, and we're watching this public trial. And based on the picture that was painted of this defendant, you're more likely to believe they're innocent or guilty depending on your worldview and maybe how you see people. And there's just a propensity of some people to, depending on what evidence is presented against science, it could be like a one-off thing, maybe a time where science let them down or didn't get it right. You're more likely to then be able to believe all the bad things that are made against the case for science versus someone who has maybe a stronger belief in science who can cast those things as more of like outliers and can then still be able to compartmentalize and believe in science as like a universal search for truth rather than being tainted by any one thing that goes wrong. And I'm still working out the analogy in my head, but did that make sense? Like that's kind of how I thought about it.
It does. It's an interesting analogy to use here. And I guess the thing that strikes me as I was listening to you and thinking about that is that in some ways, unfortunately, the news media, and I would say the media more broadly, have an important role to sort of play in contributing to that phenomena, in part because one of the biases of traditional forms of media, journalism, organizations, and I don't necessarily think this is always a bad bias, but it is a bias. They're biased toward the new. because what's new is what's news. And so if some new thing happens, they're going to report on that because it's breaking and it's newsworthy. And so that may be a case of something that doesn't necessarily make the scientific community look as good. But the kind of day to day, the same old story about how we are where we are, lifespan is where it is because of modern medicine, because of the advances in science, that isn't news, right? That is just an everyday reality that people may not see and talk about and increasingly, I'm afraid, take for granted. And so they're, to throw another analogy out there, they're more willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater than they should. Yeah, that's the challenge. Science communication is more important than ever today. It's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for scientists and for others in the communication spaces to continue to work better. I think there's been a big effort toward that direction in recent years, certainly since the COVID-19 pandemic, but there's still a long way to go.
All right. So I want to play out a bit of a scenario here. So I'm someone who lives in your community, and I heard Stephen talking on this podcast about misinformation, blah, 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 blah. And then I bump into you at the grocery store and I said, Stephen, why are we making a big deal of this misinformation thing? It sounds like I'm misquoting what the temperature was outside. It's a lot of funny, goofy stuff happening in the news that may be inaccurate. Like, what's the real danger here? It sounds like it's fairly harmless. What damage could it possibly do to the health of our people, our citizens? I'm not really seeing that connection there. Are there real world examples of how we talked about the Matrix a little bit before, where damage in the digital environment can cause harm in like the actual physical environment?
Yeah, I think, well, it's an interesting question in general. It's a very understandable question, but I think it's a particularly interesting question as we're here on a podcast focused on public health, because I think in general, those examples, it doesn't bring me joy to recognize this fact, but I believe it to be true, is that public health becomes a stark example where this can go right or go wrong, because we're not just talking about, I think it matters greatly if someone is misinformed about climate change and its impact on our society. And I think that is a really stark example of this that has huge public health impacts and in many other sectors of society. But we could especially focus on health information as a very clear indication of that, right? The harm could be extraordinary, right? If people are misinformed about the determinants of health, that could lead to increases in mortality rates. That's in turn going to have major implications for local, for national, and potentially even for global institutions across all sorts of society. That's a very kind of calculated way to say that. But if we're thinking just generally, it's a life or death issue. If people believe that bleach is going to cure a deadly virus and that a vaccine is more likely to harm than help them, they or the people who they influence may have deadly consequences as a result of that. And it's one thing to talk about individuals. It's another thing to talk about that operating at scale for entire populations or portions of populations. And then we can see the downstream effects of that when clearly some of that health communication and disinformation has shaped the views of very influential people. And in the United States, that includes RFK Jr., who is in an extraordinary, powerful position to now help make policy for millions of people. And obviously the United States and what's happening here has an impact on other parts of the world in all sorts of ways, both by spreading through travel, but also in the way that policy and economics and politics can trickle out in various ways. The effects of that can be huge. And certainly, that person is an influencer in his own right, sharing that information. So it's not just that he has a bully pulpit or something of that sort as an official, but also is doing that communication directly. So I would say the harms are very real and very visible when we look at public health as an example.
So now, I think an interesting thing to also explore before we move on to more of the positive stuff, hopefully, is one might say, okay, well, a trusted health official based on title. And so for people struggling to think about, well, how does RFK Jr., for example, benefit from these large scale disinformation, health disinformation campaign? Like, who wins with all this disinformation, health disinformation specifically? I think that's the part that warrants some uncovering, because I might think, I believe in these people. I don't think they have bad intentions, but are we missing something when we think that way?
I think some people are acting in more or less bad faith, but I think many people are acting in good faith, meaning they believe, they have been misinformed by this. They are convinced by those narratives and are spreading them with fervor oftentimes because they believe and they think other people need to hear this thing.
I see.
And so, and that's something that maybe we can come back to and talk a little bit more about in terms of some of the motivations. But in terms of some of the motivations, I should say, in terms of those motivations, I think who's winning and who's losing and why. Obviously, the same old efforts to gain influence and profit are really at the core of a lot of mis and disinformation campaigns. I mean, my latest book is titled "Hacking Hybrid Media" is kind of about some of the ways that that political actors, in particular in the United States, have used the tools of the digital age to gain attention and even to game the systems of attention in order to reach a broader audience, in order to spin a narrative that they probably believe in or want to advance. I hope they believe what they're saying. I think that's a better scenario, even if because it's even scarier to think about people who are spreading disinformation that they know to be false. But I think there is unfortunately a fair bit of that there, and certainly if they have built a following, if they built a platform for themselves of some sort, whether that's through a media company or some brand of one sort or another, they stand to profit financially, or at least through status and position. And I think that's a lot of the reason why RFK Jr. himself is in the position he's in. Yes, his name is Kennedy, but also he has gained a following in part for this, and that's a currency that he's able to leverage. But there are lots of other people who I'm afraid, and institutions that benefit from these sorts of things.
The engagement economy that Dr. Barnard describes has created what researchers call toxic virality. Internal research from social media platforms has shown that angry, divisive content generates significantly more engagement than positive content. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between justified anger and manufactured outrage. It simply just amplifies whatever keeps people scrolling. When misinformation drives engagement and engagement drives revenue, platforms have a financial incentive to let false information spread.
I mean, certainly the social media platforms benefit from this. They're able to, engagement is money, and that's what seems to matter most to these platforms. There are short stints when they get a lot of political flack for not doing more, or they have in the past, and they'll tweak their algorithms, and then they can publish a study that shows that made an effect. But Meta was one that has done this pretty effectively with Facebook for a period of time. And then a few months later, they just tweaked the algorithm right back, and engagement went back up again, profit went back up, but the flow of bad information also increased. So I think it's unfortunately it's good for platforms until regulators make it not good for and users make it not good for them, which hasn't quite yet happened. I think it's good for aspiring and established influencers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who are making a living off of schlock science communication and misinformation or disinformation, whether that's about the COVID-19 vaccine or about measles or about seed oils or something else. You know, those sorts of issues provide, an opportunity for them to sort of amplify a message that there's a whole community of people that already believe in that, and it may or may not be grounded in truth and reality, but they can help grow their audience for people who are, sort of have an appetite for that sort of content.
The picture that Dr. Barnard paints reveals a complex ecosystem where accidental misinformation mixes with deliberate manipulation, where our psychological vulnerabilities are exploited for profit, and where platforms, influencers, pharmaceutical companies, and political figures all find ways to benefit from our confusion. But understanding the problem is the first step towards solving it. Coming up next, we'll explore cutting-edge research into fighting back against misinformation before it takes hold, from psychological inoculation to pre-bunking strategies that could help immunize our minds against manipulation. That's next time on the Public Health Insight Podcast. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art designed for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.